This is as far as we can go. At the end of the road, just beyond those buildings, there is a pocket of opposition soldiers dug in.
That was the CBC's Margaret Evans reporting from inside Syria's war zone last week. One of just a few Western journalists seeing firsthand the agony and the anguish of Aleppo. She and her crew spent a dangerous 10 days in the region. Margaret has just returned to her home base of London and joins me now to talk about their experience. So we are seeing and hearing terrible pictures from eastern Aleppo in particular, the barrel bombs, the hospitals, schools being destroyed. You were only able to get around in the west part of the region, but what's your sense? Are the people in the west aware of what's happening in the east?
Yeah, Wendy, it's pretty hard for them not to be aware of it because there is an incredible soundscape going on in the background of the bombs landing in those eastern neighborhoods. And of course, they can also see the Syrian planes overhead, the regime forces flying overhead as they prepare to drop their bombs. So it creates this sense of unreality, if you like, because on the western side, people have more freedom to go about their business, and they do. They're going to school or buying bread in the morning, but they're hearing this rolling thunder, you know, in neighborhoods just a few blocks away in some cases, and are aware of people, you know, being hit by those bombs, families cowering in their basements. So it creates this very, very difficult mood, if you can imagine. On the other hand, the people in the West also, when they hear that happening, know that there might be shelling coming in their direction because the rebels also shoot the other way, and large parts of the city in the West that have been retaken by the government now have been completely destroyed. I mean, apocalyptic scenes of neighborhoods destroyed, and you have people living right along these front lines with snipers on one side and the other. So this is a city that is incredibly densely packed. People live cheek to jowl. It's not possible for one side not to understand or know what's happening on the other. I mean, for them, the tragedy is that they can't really do anything about it.
So you were speaking to soldiers and civilians. What impressions did you get from them about us, about the West?
Well, it depends on who you're talking about or talking to, of course. People who support the Syrian government, be they, you know, members of the government themselves or ordinary people, and that would tend to be communities like the Christian community who feel that the conflict has become sectarian in nature, and they would support the regime because they see it as a protector of secular values. Those people basically feel misunderstood by the West. They think that there's a double standard, that the Syrian government, and this is the line that the Syrian government puts out, that it is fighting terrorism, not a moderate opposition. And you know, there's some truth to that, but of course there is also a moderate opposition. So, you know, most of the people that we spoke to, you know, they've been isolated and brutalized for more than 5 years now. And they want the outside world to see them. And there was kind of a tentative welcome in place from people happy to see outsiders. We visited a town called Qudsaya, which had been, you know, besieged, surrounded by the Syrian army for some time, in a process of reconciliation. Some would say forced reconciliation had gone on in that town, but you know, the food had come back to the markets, and we were surrounded by people just interested that we were there. They were offering us oranges, and the falafel man wanted to give us free falafel, and people wanted to talk. So, you know, Syria has always been such an enormously civil country, in that there, even after all of this time, is there, and people quietly wanted to say, they would say, you're welcome here.
You've covered many conflict zones. How is this one different from the other places that you've been?
I think it's, you know, especially if you're talking about campaigns where there have been airstrikes involved, the Israeli-Lebanon conflict in 2006, or Iraq in 2003, and more recently Libya. Wider open spaces. I mean, the thing about Aleppo right now is that these areas controlled by the rebels and the opposition fighters are civilian neighborhoods that have been surrounded. So you have more than 250,000 people living in eastern Aleppo in these rebel-controlled areas, about an estimated 8,000 fighters. And they are surrounded, so there's no way out. And when you have the pounding that they've been getting, I think that's the difference. Is there's no retreat up the highway. People are in their homes cowering, and I think that's the other thing about this conflict that really sticks with me. It's a little bit, we touched upon it earlier, is that you're on one side, you're actually watching these bombs being dropped, and you know that on the other end somebody's being hit by them, and not necessarily a rebel fighter. There are families hiding in their basements praying, and so it creates this terrible upside down world.
Vladimir Putin, the Russians have come to Assad's aid. How much of a difference has that made?
Well, it certainly, Wendy, turned the tide of the war in his favor when they came in a year ago. And they are building on that presence steadily. On our drive up to from Damascus to Aleppo, because of all the detours you have to take, it's about a 7-hour drive, and you go through Homs. And we passed a number of Russian ammunition convoys on their way up to Aleppo. We saw coming back, those are supply lines that are being reinforced. More Russian troops on the ground than we expected. We know that they're involved in the air and that they've added to their fleet in the Mediterranean off the Syrian coast. But we saw a big Russian presence. We saw some of them in our hotel. We saw them manning checkpoints in and out towards the front line, right through the center of Aleppo. And at a lot of the checkpoints, of course, you see now pictures of Bashar al-Assad with his ally, Vladimir Putin.